Great. So, okay, hello everybody. Thank you for coming to our second meeting in the Columbia History Society today. My name is Alexander and I'm going to be presenting about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, let's talk a little bit about the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have what is Cuba, what was going around the world pre-1962 in a Cold War context, and which of these events served as catalysts for the Cuban Missile Crisis. So my argument is, Cuba had a long and troubled history with the United States. They had a semi-colonial relationship from 1898 to 1934. You had the Spanish-American Wars. And you even have the Platt Amendment, which is usually overlooked, but what this did is it established terms under which the United States would end its military occupation in Cuba. This was signed in 1907 by Senator Platt, 1901, sorry. And what this said is that the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. So this kind of puts us in the 1900s in a relation. So this kind of puts Cuba and the United States, starting in the 1900s, in a sort of relationship where the United States has all the right to go into Cuba. Eventually, this amendment is overturned, as some of you may know. But this is just to contextualize a little bit about the further resentments which were seen in the Cold War. Before 1959, the United States had a lot of economic interest in Cuba. They controlled 60 to 70% of oil refineries, 50 to 90% of electricity, telephone, and railways, and 40% of sugar plantations. Before 1959, you had Fulgencio Batista. He was president at the time. He eventually goes into exile after Fidel Castro's guerrilla force thrives in the Sierra Maestra, which were the mountains, and the urban insurrection takes place in Santiago de Cuba and Havana, which was the capital. Here we have a newspaper of El Mundo, which says Batista en fuga, huyó a Santo Domingo, which means Batista has left to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Cuba shifts kind of from an ill-defined anti-Batista revolution to a socialist regime backed by the USSR. And a common misconception is that the Cuban Revolution was not always a socialist or a communist one. So many of us may wonder, why does Cuba shift? And why does Cuba subserve to the Soviet Union so much? After reading various sources, my personal argument, and there are a bunch of different arguments, is that Castro chooses to ally itself with the USSR as it found willing and loyal partners in Soviet communists. So this sort of translates into a marriage of convenience, as the title of the site says. On the hand of the USSR, you have the USSR helped Cuba as it helped legitimize the revolutionary project in the Third World, and the USSR bought Cuban sugar and sent Soviet oil at heavily subsidized prices. It also sent weapons and technicians. And on the hand of Cuba, Cuba, after the revolution, after Fulgencio Batista leaves power in 1959, you sort of needed an economic and military support to defend the new regime which the USSR supplied. Hence, the state declares Marxism-Leninism as its driving ideology. So this is the Cuban Constitution shortly after the revolution. This is Article number 5, and it essentially says how the Communist Party of Cuba, the organized Marxist-Leninist vanguard of the working class, is a superior leading force of the society and the state. This is a picture of the Assembly of Cuba at the time. We have two prominent people. Over there we have Karl Marx, and over here we have Jose Marti, which was, Jose Marti always pushed for Cuban liberation since the 1900s. A little bit more context, from 1959 to 1961, you have the Cold War, which is basically a war between, a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Cuba was allied to the Soviet Union and is usually seen as a mere theater of the crisis, but today we're also going to challenge this traditional notion, and we will argue how Cuba was an actor in such crisis, something that we will see at the end of the presentation. More than that, we have a rapidly deteriorating relations between the US and Cuba that lead to the CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. And the invasion failed, but led Castro fearing new US intervention, which is something that we're going to see across. It's a prominent theme across the 60s, even as we go into the 1968, 1969 years, very after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So from 1959 to 1962, you have increasing ties between Cuba and the Soviet Union. The more Cuba became subservient to the Soviet Union's demands, the more it expected the Soviet Union to protect Cuba in case of an invasion. This kind of puts into context the marriage of convenience that I was talking about before. Cuba was subservient to Soviet ideology. Cuba was subservient to kind of pushing this ideology onto the rest of the continent, but at the same time it did expect the Soviet Union to protect Cuba in case of an invasion, especially since this is post Bay of Pigs invasion. This invasion had kind of already occurred. In 1961 to 1963, you also have the Sino-Soviet split, which was a worsening of relations between the two largest socialist countries, China and the USSR. This is China, this is the USSR. And this kind of threatened not only the legitimacy of the Soviet Union, but also the role of the Soviet Union as a leader in leading a socialist revolutionary project around the world, and specifically around the continent, specifically in Latin America. So what is the narrative by this point? My argument is how tensions are starting to grow, exacerbating the dynamics and problems mentioned beforehand. You have this pre-revolutionary Cuban state where the U.S. was heavily involved in the economy. You have the Platt Amendment, among many other things that just sort of exacerbate this already existing tension. In 1961, you also have the Berlin crisis. The city of Berlin was divided between the parts that were dominated by the Soviet Union and the parts that were run by America. And then in 1961, you have the development of U.S. nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey as part of a 1959 agreement. And these were the Jupiters, and they had a range of 1,500 miles. Just to put it into a little bit of context, these missiles, they were stationed in Turkey, and the amount of distance from Turkey to Moscow is from 1,000 to 1,200 miles. Okay. Then you have the United States Minuteman missile, which is introduced with a range of 5,500 miles. So you can see how this clearly goes over the distance needed to invade Russia from Turkey, where the missiles were stationed. So what is the USSR response to this? This is Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. His rationale is he wanted to bridge the missile gap with the United States, and on the other hand, he also wanted to protect Cuba from potential American invasion. The second point is more of an ideological concern, versus the first point is more of a realpolitik concern. And on the other hand, you have Castro. His rationale, he feared the United States invasion, so he kind of accepted Khrushchev's offer to put missiles on the island. In a later interview in 1992, he actually says he was against this. But if you were to ask me, he was probably against this just because it didn't go as planned. But it's interesting because Castro both encompasses these realpolitik concerns and these ideological beliefs. Before we continue, this is the anatomy of a missile. You have nuclear warheads at the top, you have the missile here, and the launch pad, and we're going to see why this is important to understand what actually ended up going to Cuba. So in May 1962, the USSR military, there is the buildup in Cuba. The plan was as follows. They wanted to deploy 44,000 troops and 1,300 civilians to Cuba, deploy 40 launchers, 60 missiles, and 60 warheads. You had two types of missiles. You had the R-12 and the R-14. The R-12 were like medium-range missiles, and the R-14 were intermediate-range missiles. I'll show you the range of where those could land in some pictures that are preceding this slide. And in the end, most of the R-12 missiles and warheads reached Cuba and were ready to be installed. The R-14s were planned but never got there, and something that I didn't add there, most of the troops that were supposed to be stationed in Cuba, you have 4,400 troops, they all were there. This is the picture I was talking about that shows up in the book Nuclear Folly by Sari Plocki. So basically these are the R-12 missiles, these are the ones that did eventually come, and these are the R-14 missiles, these did not show up. You had three routes by which the missiles would arrive to Cuba, which are depicted in those three arrows above, and then you have some parts that were shipped via air. The route was you flew from Moscow to Conakry in Guinea, and then from Conakry to Cuba. Why Conakry? I do not know. It seems like a little bit of an inconvenient route. These are the missiles that eventually get to Cuba. That is where they're stationed. We have, and before we do that, just so we're able to grasp the importance of said missiles in the country, this was a memorandum that was written by the Deputy Defense Minister of the Soviet Union at the time, and the Defense Minister of the Soviet Union at the time. This was sent to the group of Soviet forces in Cuba, so to the Soviets that were stationed in Cuba. And eventually what this said was that in a situation of an enemy landing on the island of Cuba, you are permitted to make your own decision and to use the short-range nuclear means of the Luna, or Luna IL-28 or FKR-1, which were missiles as instruments of local warfare for the destruction of the enemy. This memo was never actually sent. This is September 8th, 1962. But the fact that this is what the Soviets were considering just speaks a lot on how far this could go in the world. The American perspective in 1962, on August 29th, you have the United States finding out about the Soviet military buildup in Cuba, but they thought it was restricted to anti-aircraft missiles. And on October 14th, you have the United States discovering nuclear weaponry, but they did not know and did not believe possible that the Soviet Union had already transported the nuclear warheads. That is why the anatomy of the missile was important. You have this picture, and then you have this famous picture, I believe to be quite famous, I've seen it a couple of times, which is what the Americans saw. This is Cuba. You have the missile-ready tents, the launch position, and the missile erectors. So, Kennedy, president at the time of the United States, is confused. He has 4 different alternatives. He can invade Cuba militarily. He can hold a general airstrike against Soviet presence. He can have a surgical airstrike against the missiles, or he can pursue diplomacy. What he does kind of falls between these 2 options, and what he essentially does is that the United States holds a naval blockade of Cuba, and without initiating negotiations, demands the removal of the missiles. So that's why I say it's like sort of between the 2. By October 24th, Khrushchev sends a letter to Kennedy stating that he cannot agree to the removal of the missiles or accept the naval blockade. Continuing the chronology, Khrushchev, like Castro, fears that the United States is ready to invade Cuba, and unlike Castro, eventually decides to de-escalate. So Castro, he wanted to continue escalating. He wouldn't have cared if these missiles were sent to the United States and if the world just erupted with nuclear warfare. This is a tension that is going to prevail in these years, and we'll continue seeing that as the presentation moves on. On October 26, Khrushchev broadcast a message offering the removal of the missiles that the United States pledges not to invade Cuba and to remove its missiles from Turkey. So, what does JFK do again? Well, Kennedy liked Khrushchev's proposal, but he could not afford to look weak, so he did not take it up. Castro begins to shoot at low-flying US planes, although to no avail, and Soviet soldiers on the ground decide to shoot down a US plane as well. This is the first part of the primary source. This is the telegram from Fidel Castro to Nikita Khrushchev. Fidel Castro urges Nikita Khrushchev to take action. Fidel Castro urges Nikita Khrushchev to not fall under imperialist pressures by the United States. But what eventually happens is that Kennedy and Khrushchev make a deal. Technically, 2 deals. There's a public deal and a secret deal. The public deal says that Khrushchev would remove the missiles in the presence of a UN mission. This UN mission never actually made it to Cuba, but the rest of the deal did go through. And Kennedy would lift the quarantine and not invade Cuba. And the secret deal said that Kennedy would also remove the Jupiters from Turkey, but this would be done at a later date and had to remain secret. This is what Fidel Castro expected from the United States. He put 5 different demands, and we're going to see what ended up happening to these demands. And then we have the second part of our primary source, which is a letter from Khrushchev to Castro. This was, of course, Khrushchev tells Castro that he shouldn't move himself by temptation. He should act rationally. And he's basically going to pursue his own agenda instead, something that will create a lot of tensions in the following years post-Cuban Missile Crisis. So in the end, no nuclear warfare, which is quite good for the world, wherever you look from it. But Kennedy emerges publicly as a winner, partly because Khrushchev could not publicize the secret part of the deal, and this made Kennedy look stronger. What I argue is, even now that the deal is not a secret, Kennedy looks like a mastermind for his negotiation skills. So he's clearly the winner in this, if you ask me. Not only this, but Castro also feels betrayed because Khrushchev was not consulted about the deal and claims he does not trust Kennedy's word about the United States not invading Turkey. By all this, Castro's head is with the Soviet Union, but his heart is with China, and you have this guy emerging as the winner. So, in a book by William Feldman about Khrushchev, a book that won the Pulitzer Prize, it says, he badly misjudged the American response, improvised madly when he found out, and was fortunate that the crisis ended as safely as it did. And of course, that is what everybody in the world thought. But when he also gave a speech in Czechoslovakia around that time, and he said to them that the Soviet Union had saved the world from nuclear catastrophe. In the same speech, he also says he agreed to dismantle the missiles because their presence in Cuba was essentially of little military importance to them. So this, right now we transition to what I think is the most important, not most important actually, most interesting part of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a little bit of the understudied part of the missile crisis, and what happens after the missile crisis. So first of all, the Soviet Directorate feared that if it did not support armed combat, Cuba would act independently to the Soviet Union in the Western Hemisphere. And the thing is that the natural allies of the Soviet Union in Latin America were supposed to be the communist parties, not the guerrilla groups. However, because of the Cuban Revolution, which was successful because of the guerrilla groups, some parties considered armed struggle to be compatible with the USSR. And then in the end of the 1960s, the Soviet Union ceased to support the armed struggle in Latin America. You might ask, what does this have to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis? And essentially, the humiliation of the USSR leads to Cuba gaining power and influence in the recognition of these Soviet groups or armed groups, as I said before. What is the narrative by this point? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a catalyst for two opposing socialist revolutionary policies in America. These two guys, which I showed you before, that were shaking hands, are kind of break the relationship a little bit. On one hand, you have Cuba, which is pro-armed struggle. On the other hand, you have the Soviet Union, which is anti-armed struggle. And in the middle, you have socialism. So who's going to triumph here? In this source, it said the Cuban people had lost their respect for the Soviet Union and Khrushchev. Cubans expressed their opinions. Soviets were using Cuba as a means to resolve their conflict with the United States. And the exchange of missiles in Cuba for those in Turkey caused special irritation in Cuba because it placed two countries on equal terms. But of course, the Soviets and the Cubans wanted to be above the United States. This is what I call the start of the Cuban trauma. And to simply put it, when the Soviets took back the rockets, Cuba felt more vulnerable than before they had been installed. By 1967, which is later, but we're still in 1962, these relationships will reach a breaking point. And the two countries had different points on how to coexist with imperialism. November 1st, 1962, Fidel Castro publishes a document where he spoke of the differences of opinions with the Soviet Union. And said document is not reproduced in Soviet press nor any socialist country. And this is a telegram from an ambassador of the ambassador of Hungary to Cuba that says it is a shameful policy to hide the most serious issues from public opinion. So you can see the relationship between Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro is starting to deteriorate. None of these demands that I had presented before ever followed through. And this is a point, for me, the most interesting point, once again, where the Cuban power starts to rise. In April 1963, Castro travels to the Soviet Union to seek a permanent commitment from the USSR. He wants the Soviet Union to pledge to defend Cuba militarily and to negotiate Cuba's participation in the Warsaw Pact. The Soviets initially refuse, but eventually accept. And in another visit in 1964, the Soviets commit to helping Cuba with nuclear weapons. When Brezhnev comes to power, this is eventually overturned, but this was the case as of 1964. Let's make a pause for a second. And is Cuba dependent on Soviet subsidies, still dependent on Soviet subsidies, as I said before, becoming the model for the Soviet Union itself? And the answer is surprisingly yes. Was this actually the case? This is a small example, but one that extrapolates to many other things. In 1964, the Communist Party of Venezuela received $600,000 from the Soviet Union. In 1965, it received $800,000, so it received more money. In 1966, the amount decreased to $500,000, and in 1972, that amount went down to $300,000. Conclusion, the increase and decrease in the amounts destined for the Venezuelan Communist Party coincided with the culmination of the party's guerrilla activity in Venezuela. What this meant is, if a communist party had more armed struggle, hence guerrilla tactics, hence what the Cubans idealized for a socialist revolution, the Soviets would give them more money. And this is my favorite quote in one of the papers I read, and it says how from 1962 to at least 1967, the influence of Cuba's actions on Soviet goals and activities was disproportionate to the geographic size of the island, which to me is mind-boggling, because you have this huge country, you have this very small country. Not only that, but this very small country is totally reliant on the subsidies from the Soviet Union, and still the Soviet Union is literally subservient to all the demands that Cuba is presenting to them. This is a small map so you guys see. This is of course Russia. I couldn't find a map of the Soviet Union to do this properly with. But to me that is very amazing, very mind-boggling, and with that I end my presentation. Before we move on to the primary source, any questions?
The theory at the end was that Russia was more involved in funding the guerrilla groups in other Latin American countries because of what happened with Cuba?
My argument is the Cuban Missile Crisis put the Soviet Union in such humiliation where Cuba kind of could use that as leverage. They could use that to sort of rise to power. When I mean power, I mean like rise over their ideals. And I do think it greatly influenced. I'll send you a good paper about that if you're interested in reading.
There was a portion that said that Castro's head was in the Soviet Union, but his heart was in China. Is that a reference to a Maoist-style armed revolution, or is it something else with China?
Well, I do believe the Soviets, and this is also answering your question, part of the reason why the Soviets conceded so much to Cuba was because they were really scared that Cuba would go to China. I mentioned the Sino-Soviet split, which took place in 1963. But yeah, also probably something Maoist. That's probably more what the Soviets thought. I don't really know if there's any proof to know if that's what Fidel Castro thought. I should have added a disclaimer there, like that's what I think the Soviets thought about Castro, not necessarily what Castro thought himself. I don't think he had any intention of distancing himself from the Soviet Union, especially when you consider that the only reason why Cuba was able to run as a country at that time was due to these subsidies, which I have so thoroughly emphasized in the presentation. Alec.
This is probably a pretty loaded question, but what was like China's involvement in the Latin American region while this was going on? Like, was Cuba kind of turning to Chinese support a viable?
It wasn't very involved in the region at all. Like even like if you see the history of, for example, armed guerrilla movement in Latin America, they had a role in Sendero Luminoso in Peru, but that was much later. If there's something the Soviet Union did right was getting control of Latin America via Cuba, via their armed revolutions. Even like a figure like Che Guevara, which was highly influential, he was very much associated with Cuba and Fidel Castro, rather than with Maoist tendencies in China. JP?
Do you think it's fair to say that Khrushchev wasn't exactly on the losing side of this exchange, in that he did get the missiles out of Turkey, he did get, Russia set, like USSR protected from nuclear warheads like in their backyard, and was happy to take the okay, they're gonna take them out of Cuba, but that's fine, we were just trying to get ourselves protected. Like, is that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. I think that's fair to say if you only assess him, but if you're putting him competing against, say, JFK, you can definitely tell who was more victorious than the other. Even like like I mentioned the book that won the Pulitzer Prize, like how that biography about Khrushchev like kind of referred to him. But that is what he claimed for his entire life. That's what he claimed in that speech. Like that's what he wanted to claim. According to him, like he prevented nuclear warfare from going on. Of course, he means that explicitly in the context of Cuba and America, but he could also mean that in the context of no missiles were sent from Turkey to America. Although this does bring an interesting point, because do you remember what you were telling me before that the missiles in Cuba?
The missiles in Turkey for the US didn't even work. The generals knew that, and they still used it as negotiation. So I think if you really think about it, the US prevented functioning missiles from arriving in Cuba and had to remove non-functioning missiles from Turkey.
And of
so
course,
overall they won the exchange.
And of course, Khrushchev didn't know that.
Yeah,
he didn't know that missiles weren't functioning.
Yeah.
But if you see both of the events from a perspective of nowadays, when we know what happened and what didn't, I think it's a fair point. But if you put them side to side, I do think there's someone that emerges as victorious.
But I wonder if USSR won the Cold War, the history would be told differently. You know what I mean?
Also publicly, it makes a big difference if the US didn't publicly admit to removing.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, how everyone else interprets it, apart from the US and Russia, is definitely important when evaluating these things. And if no one else knew they removed missiles from Turkey, I think it's still a massive victory for the US.
Like PR wise.
Yeah, exactly.
What? Like what actually it said, like it was in the agreement that they couldn't disclose it. Like what was stopping them from disclosing the fact that the US had removed the missiles after the fact?
Probably, if they, I think if they would have disclosed it, like the US would have retaliated against them, you know.
Okay.
And we see like the Soviet Union clearly, like if they were scared of Cuba, they were potentially very scared of the United States. So that probably like served as an impulse for them not to do that. Jacob.
Why did the Soviets and the Cubans not bother to hide the missile sites? Like in the photos you showed, it's easy for U.S. intelligence to find.
That is a good point. I do not know the answer, and I agree. Like if you see the pictures, it's clear the missiles are there. They are like technically like I believe in the mountains in a rural location, but of course like they're very easily visible. Of course, it's also it's difficult to hide something like that when you're also expecting the thing to sort of like potentially launch someday. You know, like you can't like put them inside. But I agree they could have done a better job.
Couldn't it be argued that the crisis itself was actually an American success because there were nuclear missiles put in Turkey and Italy, and it wasn't seen as this potentially world-ending conflict, whereas when Soviet Union put missiles close to the United States, it was seen as this massive crisis.
I agree, and even like as Seb said before, like apparently the missiles in Turkey were not functioning, but of course nobody knew that. You know, that's something that they knew after. Yeah, fair take.
Also, I think potentially maybe the reason that Khrushchev didn't want to hide, or the Cubans couldn't be bothered with hiding the missiles, if the US had missiles in Turkey and Italy that could hit Russia, and no one made a big deal out of it, I think Khrushchev was miscalculating the response from America, which is what you said in your presentation. He didn't expect such a big reaction.
Yeah.
When the US has the same thing.
Yeah.
in Europe.
And it's interesting also because if you look at the history between the U.S. and the USSR prior to this, sort of when JFK, like when he originally comes to power, he thinks that nuclear weapons-wise, the Soviet Union and America were on the same level, and they were not on the same level. Like America was like at a much higher level, but he thought they were at the same level. So they kind of like his initial decisions like towards the Soviet Union like kind of put the two on an equal scale in the balance, but that was not even like the case.
I think going back to Alex's question about what role does China play in all of this, I think you mentioned about the Sino-Soviet split, right? And I think that's a very important role in both like ruining Soviet Union's credibility, but also that because of the Sino-Soviet split, the Russian military had to move a bunch of military to the east with the Chinese border, and so that kind of thins out their military capability and supply on the west side. And so, when Khrushchev was faced with the problem and threat of the U.S. and by placing their missiles in Turkey, he kind of is a bit more worried because now their military is all thinned out that they need to reach a diplomatic negotiation first rather than engage in military-wise, because they would, even if they would move all the military away from China, that would take a long time for that to travel all the way back. So there's a threat of that. Would you agree?
Yeah. Like, no, like it makes sense. I don't really know much about the Sino-Soviet split, but it like based on what you said, it definitely makes sense.
You said that originally the Cuban Revolution like had a lot of liberal aspects to it. It wasn't only like a Marxist-Leninist movement. So like, what happened to that? How did that deteriorate? Yeah.
Like how it became a Marxist-Leninist revolution.
Yeah.
Well, that is the thing. That is my argument. Essentially, like if you see, like the Fidel Castro, he was initially part of the Ortodoxos. Then he created his own party, which was the Movimiento 26 de Julio, the M26, and eventually he comes into power. And like when the revolution triumphs, the first guy who was he wasn't even the first president. Like he wasn't even the first head of state. There was another head of state. I don't remember his name now. I think his name is Manuel. I don't remember his last name. But eventually, I feel like when when Fidel comes to power, he's in need of allies. The whole continent is against him. He's definitely not riding the wave. He's doing everything but riding the wave. So he needs someone that is going to support him, and that is when the Soviet Union like kind of comes in with this like proposition to support him, at least economically, which I think seems very appealing to him. Not only that, but initially like some like according to sources, like his brother, he was a communist from the very beginning, so he had certain like socialist and communist like ideology and like tendencies. But of course, like when the Soviet Union comes forward and tries to establish a relationship with him, he like definitely establishes that. I just think it's like, and to sum it up, I think it was a marriage of convenience.
Do you think that it was just because Cuba was so close to the US that the US had such a big reaction? Because I was just double checking, but I think submarine nuclear technology did exist, or was really starting to get going around this time. So, which means a sub could literally have been anywhere in the ocean and fired a missile to hit the States. So, do you think it was just really a permanent image thing?
I do think, yeah, also I do think so. Of course, you have this map here where you see like, of course, Cuba, it's very close, and you see that the missiles, they could kind of reach anywhere in the United States. But the reason why I gave the context at the beginning when I talked about like how involved the U.S. was in Cuba, the Platt Amendment, etc., was because I believe like most of it is as you say, but I do believe like prior to all of this, the United States had always had its grip on Cuba, like always had its grip. They were there in their plantations, they were there in their oil refineries, they were there whenever they needed to be there, as the Platt Amendment said. And of course, like when you shift the status quo, especially with the United States or actually any major superpower in the world, you are probably going to get retaliation. I do think it's a good point.
I guess there's a really interesting parallel that could be drawn with modern day Russia and Ukraine, in that Ukraine is in Russia's backyard. Historically, there's like Russia has a claim to sovereignty over Ukraine. Like Putin has this idea of, no, this is our territory and our people. But they've been shifting more and more to the West, to NATO, to the EU, and that's prompted like a great response militarily from Russia in terms of like them feeling threatened and invading and taking territory. And I don't know, like you could see them as parallel situations.
I see the parallels, yeah, definitely. And I know like even if you see even if you like take a look into the history of Crimea, and when when the Tsars were in place, when Catherine was queen, yeah, it makes sense.
I think in one of the sources, I don't know which one, but it mentioned something about missiles originating in Guantanamo Bay. Did that was that just like, no, it was in one of the slides.
Yeah.
One of your
One of the
annotations
demands
said-
being removed
Yeah.
US
Like-
presence from Guantanamo Bay.
Did they
written
end
in,
up
like,
staying
red.
there, or did they get removed as well? I think it was the
Wait, go back.
This one, right?
No, you had the annotation in red. It said missiles still in Guantanamo.
And,
I think it's isn't. Are you sure it's not?
no, it was an annotation at the bottom.
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry. No, keep
No,
going, keep
it was,
going.
I think it was actually at the very end, because like you were saying how none of
Oh,
them-
there.
Yeah, no demand
Back?
followed through.
This one.
No,
No,
on
No,
the-
no,
Keep going. There.
There you go.
yeah.
It says
Still
still
missiles
missiles in
in
Guantanamo.
Oh, that's what other voices heard on the streets protested that the Soviets had demanded the removal of the missiles.
Is that like on like U.S. missiles in Cuba or? Sorry. Never mind.
Yeah, no, I think so. This is not in the source. This is me annotating
Yeah,
my
yeah.
reading. So yeah, I'm not sure, but I'll get back. I'll look into it
I just
and
know
answer.
if you annotated it. It's
Well,
something interesting.
I think you mean like still US military presence in Guantanamo. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Yeah. That's probably what I
one
meant.
with
I was
missiles
probably
in Guantanamo
yeah, exactly.
Bay.
Like I mean like yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Crack the code.
Interesting.
Jack.
So obviously the crisis, like from a political perspective, really only concerned the U.S., Cuba, and the USSR, at least in like, you know, the way that we're learning about this now. But if you look at the map that had like what the missiles could actually reach, there were so many Central American nations that were evidently in striking distance. And it just makes me wonder if there were any leaders from those countries who had anything to say about what was going on. Like, what was the dialogue coming from a place like Nicaragua that, should a missile hit, would so obviously be in danger? Like, was there room for that in this crisis?
Well, the thing is, if any invasion were, like, if any potential invasion would have gone through, like, the target was the United States. Like, the target would have never been, at least initially, you know. Of course, like, the United States had its allies. For example, you asked about Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, I believe by this point, the Somozas were in power. So this was before Nicaraguan turned socialist and communist, as it is currently. But of course, like, the initial target was the United States, so I think like any further retaliation would have been seen after. But yeah, I'm not sure about what the, like, well, I don't know what certain leaders were saying, but based on like ideology, like I know like Somoza was in Nicaragua, he was probably, like he was actually best friends with America, so he was probably in favor of whatever America had to say. Yeah.
This is just like out of curiosity, I don't know if you know this, but like for example, the R-12 and the R-14, like how long would it have taken a missile from Cuba to have gotten to somewhere like Chicago or something?
Oh, I have no clue.
I remember watching a video that I think it could get to Washington in 13 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
Cool.
That's fast.
I was thinking about the whole thing that the revolution was initially communist in its way. While it's probably hard to argue that Cuba is objectively a success, but looking at it from the communist point of view, I guess it worked out for them. Because other movements in Latin America, like Salvador Allende in Chile, which wasn't allied formally with the Soviet Union, it was unceremoniously ended. Some other movements like Perón in Argentina, who tried to have a third way, was also ended. So potentially the best thing to happen to Cuba, if you look at it from a purely communist point of view, was to ally with the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you.
Should we move on to the primary source?
Yeah. So, I'll just read the context as we familiarize ourselves with questions and whatever. It says this document contains primary source materials related to the Cuban Missile Crisis, specifically letters, telegrams, and cables exchanged during this tense period in 1962. Included are urgent communications between Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev, revealing Castro's perception of imminent U.S. aggression and his call for potential nuclear retaliation if Cuba were attacked. And additionally, it highlights internal Cuban leadership reactions to Khrushchev, decisions to dismantle Soviet missiles in Cuba, illustrating the complexities and tensions surrounding Soviet-Cuban relations during the crisis. Did anybody have any thoughts about the source? JP.
I think it's really fascinating how much more rabid Fidel Castro is than Khrushchev. I guess it makes sense, you know. Khrushchev has the nuclear bombs on his conscience. He knows that, you know, Moscow is going to be hit, or he thinks that it's going to be hit, and that's going to lead to world catastrophe. So it makes sense that he would be a little bit more measured in his response. But I'm wondering why Castro was so, you know, he was freaking out about this. He was advocating for like something that might lead to a total nuclear war and the destruction of the entire world. I'm curious as to if there were any rational incentives that he might have had to do that. Is it like provoking the Soviet Union to take direct action or something like that because he felt like he was going to get invaded? Did he want less than what he asked for, but like had to posture that he wanted more? I don't know. I don't know if history knows, but that's what I'm taking from here.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment on that. I think like an interesting aspect that hasn't been really touched is the tensions within like U.S. leadership on how to handle the crisis, and I think there's a direct division between, you know, JFK and the military branch. And, you know, there's a lot of documents that says that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were trying to redeem themselves from the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the CIA was heavily, pushing towards a military confrontation. There's, anecdotes about like they actually like shot over the Russian ships. There was a lot of, just kind of this not coup, but this like division, this conflict between what JFK wanted to do with like the diplomacy as Alejandro was stating and what they wanted to do with more like a military invasion. So I guess that I interpret it more as Fidel Castro sees that like the U.S. they're 90 miles away and they have a blockade around the island, so they could actually go and invade. Whereas a direct response from Russia would incite World War III, and if the U.S. were to invade Cuba, maybe Fidel doesn't have the belief or the trust that they come and back them up. So I interpret it like that.
A question. Didn't Iceman come off a little hypocritical to when Khrushchev asked Castro to not shoot down planes that fly over Cuban airspace, when like the Soviets would and did shoot down when they found U.S. planes flying over Soviet airspace?
Yeah. No, I agree. I remember, like this is sort of more into your point, but like a point that I like to argue is how states are multifarious entities. What this means is you can have a single state, you can have the Soviet Union, you can have the United States, and you have different people within the state pursuing different things. In the case of America, for instance, you have JFK wanting to pursue a certain agenda, and then the military wanting to pursue a different agenda. But states are not only like multifarious entities in the way, like you have all these like different perspectives, not just like from different people, but also like from the same people at different like time points, and a lot of like, of course, like they knew the other person was gonna read this, so you think like how much of this is actually what they wanted to do, and how much of this is just like a certain way of arguing something in order to like exhibit a certain response.
This sounds a bit weird, but how do you actually, get the information like from this kind of telegram? Like, would this not have been like a highly classified like document?
Like, where is this?
Yeah. I mean, like, where do people get it from?
The CIA has a website. It's called, like, you can Google FOIA CIA, and there are a bunch of declassified documents.
So the CIA would have, like when would the CIA have read this, for example? Surely not in the moment, because then they would have been.
Definitely not in the moment. Yeah. I don't know. But like you can see when the document, you can see like when they found the document and when they declassified it. I think if this was declassified by the CIA, this was probably declassified like in the 90s, So if I was giving this lecture in 1983, I couldn't have said everything I'm saying, But it is a pretty interesting website, and there's actually there's a Columbia professor that's building this he's building this sort of like AI thing. There's like 5 million documents there, and you can ask him like, oh, show me declassified documents about I don't know, Margaret Thatcher, and he'll pull it out. It's pretty interesting and pretty cool. I agree.
In terms of the dynamics that people gather from reading these two letters, what do people think the relationship is between Cuba and the USSR at this point, in terms of power, who's really making the decisions?
I think it really looks like, I don't know, Russia or the USSR is in like a strong position here, and I mean, JP was talking to Fidel Castro's anger, and like, I think it's like, obviously, he wants Cuba to be this independent nation, and you have one of the most powerful countries in the world at your doorstep, like about to invade, and he's furious. And like 2 days later, like Russia says, show patience, restraint, and more restraint, and he's basically just telling them like, wait, like it's not a big deal, like nothing's really gonna happen, and you can kind of just see, I don't know, like how this is just like another domino or like another like satellite. I forget the exact word for it, but it's just
proxy.
Proxy for like the USSR. Like they don't really like care what's going on there per se. It's just kind of like another way to show their dominance, and I don't know, just like another card in their hand. And it's just like, oh, like you're about to get invaded, but just wait, just like chill out. It's like not that big of a deal.
Also, one thing that I found interesting whilst reading is I'm not sure from the tone from Khrushchev how certain you can be that in the case of the US was to invade, that the USSR would actually support them. Because to me, reading it, it seems like they're not 100% in it. Like we'd support you outright, regardless of what happens. They're more really urging for peace and nothing else.